Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back for most of you to day two of this first inaugural Evangelical Leaders Summit. It is a real joy to have you here, and we have a very full day ahead, beginning with what I think should be a fascinating conversation about the meaning and purpose of social justice. We have some leaders of some amazing organizations in the room, so I hope that you'll take full advantage of opportunities to network and overlap during several of the breaks. But we begin picking up where we left off last night with a conversation about how to help the poor in more effective ways, something that is at the heart of AEI and at the heart of what Sojourners is working on as well. So we're here to have this conversation about social justice, kind of a hot topic these days. As you may know, back in May, when Thomas Piketty's English version of the book Capital in the 21st Century came out, it sold over 250,000 copies in its first month. Something was afoot. Even if people didn't finish reading that 577-page book, they at least were buying it. That said something. The President of the United States has used the word fairness more times in his public rhetoric and in the campaign season, as well as the time that he's been in office, more than any other topic. Fairness, fairness, fairness. But why are we so divided? What is the true nature and meaning of social justice? What's the area of common ground between left and right? And what are also some of the notable distinctions that exist? Today we have two top-notch speakers to bring us all into this conversation. And we will begin with Jim Wallis, the president of Sojourners. Jim founded Sojourners several decades ago. His most recent book is The Uncommon Good: How the Gospel Brings Hope to a World Divided, out by Brazos Press this year. He is serving on the President's the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, and also serves as the chair of the Global Agenda on Council on Faith for the World Economic Forum. He's had a number of bestsellers in the past, including The Great Awakening, Reviving Faith and Politics in a Post-Religious Right, and God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. So Jim will kick things off with some comments, and then he'll be followed by Arthur Brooks, my boss and AEI's leader, who is, of course, the president of AEI and the Beth and Ravenel Curry Scholar in Free Enterprise. He served as a professor at Syracuse University in the past. He is the author of 10 books and many topics on articles that range from economics to the arts to applied mathematics. His books include The Road to Freedom, How to Win the Fight for Free Enterprise, Social Entrepreneurship, Who Really Cares, and a number of others. And before becoming an academic and AEI's president, Arthur served as a musician, as a professional French hornist with the Orchestra of Barcelona and other ensembles. We're in for a treat. We have a number of follow-up questions that will follow immediately after the comments, and you each have a little card in front of you. And in order to get questions in efficiently, I'd like to ask that if you do have a question, you just pass that over to your right, toward the middle of the room, and we will take questions in that way that follow up. Beginning off, Jim Wallis, AEI.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Arthur. Thank you. We become kind of a tag team on the road and friends along the way. People set us up for debates about these things, and debates became conversations. So I'm glad for this conversation here today. Sojourners' mission statement, you mentioned our mission and AEI's. Ours is this: Sojourners' mission is to articulate the biblical call to social justice, inspiring hope and building a movement to transform individuals, communities, the church, and the world. Kind of a big mission statement, like AEI's. So I'm glad for this focus today on justice. Now, the vision of social justice is so biblically rich, and what human flourishing means is so deep. I'm going to focus my remarks briefly here on what I think is a very timely topic, which is this: our need for a new conversation and a new approach to overcoming poverty. A new conversation and new approach. And I was struck this morning, I was reminded of a story I'd like to begin with. I was just in South Africa for a month on a tour there with a new generation of leaders there who are really taking up this topic. because economic inequality is actually greater now in South Africa than during apartheid years. They're taking up a new mission around this. So here's a story I told them, but I want to share with you. Authors, we're both authors, and you get these letters saying, please come and talk to us about your book. We're reading it. Well, I got an interesting one day from the inmates at Sing Sing prison who were reading a book, they said. Could you come and talk to us? So I said, sounded interesting. So I wrote back, said, sure. When do you want me to come? And this young brother writes back and says, well, we're free most nights. He says, we're kind of a captive audience here, a real comedian. And the warden generously gave us a room in the bowels of that infamous prison. I had 80 guys alone for 4 hours. One of them said this to me, which I'll never forget. He said, Jim, almost all of us in this prison are from 4 or 5 neighborhoods in New York City. 4 or 5 neighborhoods, the whole prison. He said, it's like a train begins in my neighborhood. You get on when you're 9 or 10 years old, and the train ends up here at Sing Sing. Powerful metaphor, an urban train beginning in only certain zip codes, ending up at a place like Sing Sing. But then he said, and I love this, but I've been converted. He was part of the New York Theological Seminary program inside the walls to teach Masters of Divinity inside the walls. I later did their commencement one day with security and all the rest. When I get out, he said, I want to stop that train. So my question for us today is, what are the trains that we need to stop? And how does our conversion relate to that? So the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty generated more conversation than I was expecting, which I thought was a very positive thing. And not just from the faith community, but from the political side and both sides of the aisle. That to me is a very hopeful thing, calling for a new approach toward those whom Jesus in Matthew 25, which you knew I'd say at some point, calls the least of these. And what he says there, which converted me, that's my conversion text, brought me to Christ. He says, I'll know how much you love me by how you treat them, the least of these. Very simple as that. So, so several points just to discuss, I think, for this conversation. First, and you expect this from an evangelical in an evangelical conference, go to the scriptures. So when I was in seminary, Trinity, it was some time ago at seminary, our little group did a Bible study of every single text in the Bible about the poor, every single scripture, the poor, the oppressed, the vulnerable, poverty, wealth, all that. We found 2,000 verses on the subject in the Bible. And one of my team, who's still with us today, took a pair of scissors, took an old Bible like this, and began to cut all those scriptures out. And it took them a long time to do that. This is the second most prominent theme in the Old Testament. In New Testament, one of every 16 verses. In the Synoptics, one of every 10. In Luke, one of every 7. I did not name my son after Luke Skywalker. Right? When we were done, that Bible was literally in shreds, in pieces. It was falling apart like this. It was full of holes, which is not the same as a whole Holy Bible. The good news, happy ending there is, I'm glad Rich Stearns is here. I'm told with that story and other things in mind, the British and American Bible Society and World Vision have created now the Poverty and Justice Bible. All those scriptures left on the floor have now been put back into the Bible in World Vision orange. I'm saying go to the orange. Go to the orange. This can't begin. We won't succeed without a whole new Bible study in our churches around what does the Bible say about the poor and what insights here are there to how you overcome poverty. These aren't just texts. There's insight. There's strategy here. Let's look at that. Go to the orange. And so we have stacks of these at our place. We should have brought them today. If you want to order one, Julie, raise your hand. Juliet will take your orders. The Poverty and Justice Bible, all right? So it starts with Bible study. It has to begin that way. This isn't just about politics or even social action. This is about restoring the integrity of the Word of God in our lives, our congregations, our neighborhoods, our nation, and the world. Second, and I like the way Arthur is also saying this, we need to go to the poor and vulnerable themselves and listen. Too much talk about the poor in liberal and conservative bubbles in this town without ever knowing and listening to poor people. It's a pilgrimage. It takes us beyond our comfort zones. But I want to say, I've learned most about the world by being places I was never supposed to go, meeting people I was never supposed to meet or know. That will change us. Matthew 25 is still my conversion passage. Being with those people Jesus names keeps teaching me more about what it means to follow him. Pope Francis calls for a church for the poor, but listen carefully, he calls for a church of the poor. Now that is meant to transform us, and it will. That's a different perspective than just talking about the poor from safe places. 3, do we have to change politics and economics? Yes. Yes is the answer. But that won't happen until we as people of faith, and I'm assuming here most of us are people of faith, put aside the politics and the ideologies that still control us and push at us and want to shape us from all sides, and put people ahead of politics. And that means from the right and the left, both willing to challenge our side and not just the other side. Now, my opinion, I'll just throw this out. I'll start with my critique of Democrats, given where I am today. Democrats are reluctant to challenge the public sector because that's where their votes and constituencies and money are. Maintain it the way it is, because that's where our power is. Republicans are reluctant to challenge the private sector, because that's where their money and their constituencies and interests often are. I think we've got to start by saying current poverty rates in America are morally unacceptable to us as people of faith. And Republicans and Democrats have both failed 50 years later to overcome poverty. I think I want to start there. 46 million people, 1/5 of all children, 4 in 10 black children, 3 in 10 Hispanic children. Poverty that high is a scandal, and poverty still has a pigmentation in America. That has to be said. So we think we must start by unequivocally stating that such poverty in America is morally unacceptable to us. Can I get an amen to that? That's, I think, where we start. The good news is that ideas and energy for new visions are most likely to come from civil society. And I think the faith community in particular, we're going to have to lead here. I saw that again in South Africa, and I see here, we're going to have to lead, I think, and then call both the private and public sector to account. Now, here's the problem. Prior allegiances, politically and ideological agendas, really could undermine this new conversation. So we have to find, I think, as Arthur loves this word, there are social entrepreneurs, I call them, Arthur, emerging now in all the sectors, and those people are really providing many of the answers that we need. 4, I'll be real clear about this. I think we have to stop our endless battle over the need for a safety net. Many of us here today, Galen's here, Catholic Conference, others, NAE, are part of the circle of protection where we say that alarmingly high deficits are indeed a moral issue. They are. But how you reduce deficits and who suffers from what you do is also a moral issue. But I think it's time for conservatives to say, as Arthur has said, that adequate and effective safety nets are an important achievement of a good society. That's important to say. But liberals need to say that safety nets, even if they help keep more people out of poverty, will not alleviate poverty. Safety nets will not do that. We have to say that back and forth to each other and say what else is now needed. So even if food stamps kept 4 million Americans out of poverty in 2011, we need to help people not to need food stamps. That should be a common agenda. So let's have, Arthur, a metric, and as you said, a people-based discussion of how to provide and operate, let me just be real clear about this, effective safety nets to protect low-income people, especially families, without building dependency, and that also open doors to opportunity. How do we do that? Let's support together good government safety nets and agree together they will not eliminate poverty, and work together to find out what will. And we got to find some common ground, like how earned income tax credits, EITC, incentivizes work by topping up wages and kept 6 million Americans above the poverty line in 2011. So, and here's something I'll just be provocative in saying here. When it comes to the spiritual and practical importance of charitable giving, liberals can learn a lot from conservatives who have been more generous in their giving. The rich can learn from the poor who consistently are more generous than the rich in their giving. But those who suggest that charity alone can create adequate safety nets or eliminate poverty either haven't been doing their math or don't know too many poor people. So let's go beyond the old arguments. I'll just say, for me, the God of the Bible is a God of justice and not just a God of charity. Now, that means we need a real discussion around principles. In your paper, Arthur, you lifted up principles, and I am going to too. One, I would say, for me, there are three. Three fundamental principles or commitments to overcoming poverty: work, family, education, those three. And they cut across political lines: work, family, and education. And I think both faith and community are critical contributors to all three. So very briefly, work. Work has to work. Work has to work for people. Working hard and full-time in America should allow people to lift themselves out of poverty, and for millions, that doesn't do it today. That's a problem. We all know the numbers. Those who make their living from wages have experienced decades now of wage stagnation and have not recovered from the Great Recession, while those who earn most of their money from investments continue to gain. Labor capital has declined, while money capital has soared, and those who work for salaries are seeing their incomes and lives diminished, while those who make their money from investments are seeing their wealth skyrocket. That's an issue. The benefits of this economy are skewed dramatically now to those already at the very top, while the majority are not seeing their lives improving or the prospects for their kids being very hopeful. So we're seeing economic growth, but the gains are not being widely distributed. Inequality is growing. This is important from what I'm trying to say. Inequality is growing and social mobility is declining at the same time. And the combination of those two is a very bad one. So literally, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. It doesn't have to be that way. Hasn't always been that way in America. The rising tide can lift all the boats and not just the yachts. God doesn't mind prosperity as long as we share it. In God's economy, I put it simply, God's economy, there is enough if we share it. There is enough if we share it. So I've been talking to CEOs about this, and one of them doesn't live far from here. He runs one of the biggest hotel chains in the country. He wants work to work for his employees, and the discussion grew from raising the minimum wage, which is something I support, which we might debate about on a different day. But we got to a deeper issue of what I'd call a living family wage. I was in the UK recently speaking to the General Synod on the Common Good, and John Sintomu, the Archbishop of York there, is the chair of a new campaign called the Living Wage Campaign, where business leaders voluntarily decide to pay living family wages to their employees, often because of their own faith. That's leading by example, and we should discuss that here. And again, we have to get to the poor and see the human face of all this. I wrote a column years ago called Burger King Mom, a woman I met in a Burger King restaurant in my neighborhood, and I noticed at her break she was going to a table and a bunch of kids were there. She was tutoring her kids during her breaks on their homework while working at Burger King. And she became emblematic to me of a category we often don't really relate to, or the story painfully recently, you saw it, of a woman who died in her car, smelling fumes apparently, while in a stint between 3 jobs at Dunkin' Donuts, 3 different jobs, and she died. And we hear here now she used to take pizza and blankets to homeless people. Well, these are not teenagers in our homes. These are low-wage income people who somehow the churches need to embrace and support. Family. Let me just say as clearly as I can, particularly to those on the left who may be here, marriage is an anti-poverty measure. And both conservatives and liberals should be saying that. More people are raising children alone, more children are being born out of wedlock, and more of them are living in poverty. That is just the facts. So many kids I've known in poor neighborhoods where I've lived for a long time literally have never been to a wedding in their lives, ever. Or been even to a home where there was a mother and a father, ever once. How can kids do what they've never seen? The data shows that broken families, boys without active fathers in particular, are much more vulnerable to every social danger, being undereducated, underemployed, falling into crime, addictions, violence, gangs, all of that. And it's true, some old welfare programs that mistakenly undermine marriage were part of the problem. That's true. But also massive unemployment and the lack of living family wages also breaks down and breaks up families. And the mass incarceration of men of color, which the data clearly shows has racial biases in our criminal justice system, has emptied poor communities of husbands and fathers. If we care about family, we have to address all of those issues. Finally, education reform is the new civil rights movement. Too many schools in too many of our poorest neighborhoods are more like prisons than schools, as my story at the beginning suggested, are part of the train that leads kids to prison. We know the numbers, stark comparisons. Suburban public schools, urban public schools. Private schools, public schools. And I don't believe we would accept those numbers if our urban public schools were full of white children too. We just wouldn't accept it. So how can we change that? It's complicated, it's not our topic today, but I'd say very briefly, principles are important. 1, students are the most important persons in our schools, students. 2, schools are turning around kids' lives in the poorest neighborhoods. 3, holding our educators accountable to educating is the best way to increase the status of teachers, which is also key. Finally, last point about business, since we're at this private enterprise place, which I'd like to affirm, let me offer a word about purposeful and not just profitable business. In my role it's actually chair of the Global Agenda Council on Values for the World Economic Forum. We're having many conversations all the time now about how business must go beyond just doing philanthropy, but to use business to solve problems of poverty. Use business. The business conversation has to shift from, I'd call, short-termism to long-term calculations, from simply a shareholder economy to a much broader stakeholder economy, to inadequate metrics of quarterly shareholder profit versus the impact of decisions today on the next generation. And as Jim Kim, new president of the World Bank, is telling all of us, business or economic activity alone doesn't solve or end poverty. You have to aim at ending poverty with a clear business plan. That's what we're learning now. For that plan, I refer you to something that our council put out called a new social covenant for business people, which holds up 3 key values for our conversation today: human dignity, the common good, and stewardship. So let me end with a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which could inspire our forging this new conversation. Given the poverty rates we have now, given the political deadlock, given the hopelessness growing in our poorest neighborhoods, which I'm deeply concerned about, what King said is really something that should inspire us now. He called for the fierce urgency of now. The fierce urgency of now. That's where I think we are today, and I thank you, Arthur, for this conversation.
Good job. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thanks to all of you. Welcome to AEI. I've been looking forward to this conversation. This is a program reaching out so that AEI can learn from the evangelical community in the United States. This is a new venture for us in the past 5 years, and I'm especially grateful to Josh for his leadership in this, and to you for helping to steward this conversation here at AEI. Thank you, Jim. What an inspirational set of comments. The thing that strikes me first is that I feel like you just read from my notes. It's, there's so much common ground, from public policy, the public policy implications of what he's saying, to the basic concern for the poor, to a biblical worldview, which is, at a secular institution like AEI, is not in our mission statement, but it is written on my heart as a Christian, and certainly all of you here as Christians as well. Now, to begin with, you'll notice when you leave that the place is a zoo outside, and there are 14 camera crews that are filing in right now. I'd like to tell you it's because the mainstream media is dying to hear a conversation between me and Jim on social justice. It's because Dick Cheney is next door talking about terrorism. But I'm glad you're here. and we will make news. We will make news. We need to stay at this. What do we agree on? What did Jim and I agree on? Well, almost everything that he said. Almost everything that he said. We've had many productive conversations over the years, and what we found a few years ago when people started setting us up to be interlocutors, debaters on college campuses is it's not that we were trying to not disagree, because we're plenty disagreeable people. And you know, look, I mean, we both had some very tough debates with other people. The thing about it is when your heart is focused on something that's truly important and you agree, you can't get off that topic. That's the important thing. Have you ever noticed that, I mean, you can have some bitter discussions around the Thanksgiving table with people in your family who don't agree with your political views, but you agree on so much that you keep talking about, you know, so what are your kids doing this year? The things that you really love and the things that you really care about. I think that's the reason that we have a hard time debating, per se. Maybe we'll take a shot a little bit later. We both have an incredibly strong view in social justice. And by that, I'm going to be very specific and talk about an overt moral orientation toward the vulnerable, toward the poor. Not just the poor in money, but the people who have been left behind, who are vulnerable in all of the things that we treasure in modern life. So where does the orientation toward the vulnerable start? The conversion passage for Jim is Matthew 25. As you did for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me. This is the canonical understanding of the Christian orientation toward the poor. But it doesn't start there. It starts there with the birth of our Savior, who was born into absolute poverty to teach each one of us detachment from material things. And then Christ grows up and has to remind us that as you did for the least of these, our brothers and sisters, you did for me. And all of us have to remember this. And we're living in the greatest country economically in the world and the seat of power of the United States, and we're driving by people who are poor. My wife reminds me that when we're in Bethesda, Maryland, this Tony suburb where I live, and there's a guy asking for money on the corner, and you can suspect his motives. You can go all through the things that go through your head. My wife reminds me, says, look into his face. That's the face of Jesus. That's what we learn in Matthew 25. A source of salvation for us, of course, is what we do for the poor. I mean, this is the central organizing insight. I've learned this from Jim. I've learned this over the course of my adult life, that it's actually not entirely and not even mostly about what we do for them, but what they do for us. Cardinal George, the Roman Catholic cardinal in Chicago, was talking last year to donors, his big, rich donors. You got to have donors. I love donors. And I heard Jim say that, wealth is good, but you have to give. And Cardinal George was talking to his wealthiest donors last year, and he said, don't forget, the poor need you. They need you. They need you to get off the street. They need you to have an adequate life. But don't forget that you need them so that you can stay out of hell. Ooh, tough stuff, right? Tough stuff. What does it mean to have a preference for the poor? It means almsgiving and prayer. Jim quoted my Pope, Pope Francis, that we have to have a church of the poor. Here's how Pope Francis talks about it. I love this. He says this: the shepherd has to smell like the sheep. Think about that. We got to smell like the sheep. Bob Woodson is here. Bob Woodson smells like the sheep because he's been living with he comes and he talks to me and he says, don't talk about the poor. Talk with the poor. That's the important thing. This is what we're trying to do at AEI. This is what Jim does every day. It's what we all are called to do. And this, of course, is our privilege, as Cardinal George would remind us in his incredibly evocative and sort of scary language. So how do you do that? As I said, almsgiving, prayer, fasting comes up again and again and again in the scriptures. But we live in this unbelievably wealthy, prosperous, well-organized society. And so we can do something that's an even more amazing privilege by historic standards. And that's that we can create a government safety net. This is the greatest thing that free enterprise and capitalism has ever created. No time in the history of the world has any society been able to afford this, conceive of this, organize this. It's not just our obligation, it's our privilege to declare peace on the safety net for the truly indigent. Now, there's a lot in that. I'm ready to declare war on the safety net for crony corporations, and war on the safety net for people who don't need it, and war on the safety net for the people who are rent-seeking and getting close to government and looking for privilege. That's wrong, and it's a waste of money, and it's the reason that we're becoming insolvent, and when we become insolvent, we'll have austerity, and when we have austerity, it's going to hammer the poor because it always does. If you are an advocate for the poor, if you love the poor, you must be for fiscally sane policies, which I am, and which I know Jim is too. So where does this leave us at this point? Well, as an institution, I've been president of AEI for 6 years. I reflect on the reason I came to this institution. I was a college professor. I taught at Syracuse. I mean, Jim, my favorite thing that Jim just said, go to the Orange. I taught at Syracuse for almost 10 years. Let me tell you, go to the Orange, my friends.
I didn't mean that.
That's right. I hear what I want to hear, my friend. Why did I leave a tenured full professorship? Why did I do that? It's crazy. I was like a French bureaucrat, I mean, like I can do anything I want. I can kill somebody, no responsibility. The reason is because I wasn't a warrior. The reason is because I couldn't get the job done to really live the mission that I had. And what's the mission? I already told you about Matthew 25:40, right? That's what brought Jim fully into the faith. But I want to remind you of another part of Matthew 25 that's important too for the social justice mission. That's Matthew 25:14. Matthew 25:14 is the beginning of the passage of the parable of the talents, where Christ describes the master, the mildly tyrannical master, who goes away and he takes 3 servants and he gives one of them 5 talents, another one 2, and another one 1. And the first 2 servants, they invest the talents for a rate of return in double. They double the talents, and the master comes back and says, "Good and faithful servant, you've done well with what you've been given. I will give you so much more." The last servant, he takes the talent and he buries it in the ground, and he comes back and his servant said, "You wretched servant, you misused what I have given you, and now what little you have will be taken away." Now, what do we learn from that? This is not a parable about financial markets. This is not a parable about investing per se, I don't think. In my view, and again, he's the professional. I'm a layman. But in my view, this is talking about the gifts that we're given, the talents that we're given. We are given special abilities and gifts. We have to use them to their fullest. And to do that, we need a system that makes it possible for us to earn our success and to share it with others. That's what we really need. You heard at the very beginning, I used to be a professional musician. I played in the Barcelona Symphony for a long time. It's a great time. I got married there, and that was the best thing, because 25 years later, that's the part of Barcelona that lives in my house. And well, I live at her house, kind of, but anyway. And when I was a musician, my favorite composer was Johann Sebastian Bach. Right? And Johann Sebastian Bach is probably the greatest composer who ever lived, at least by traditional standards. I mean, everybody loves Bach, so this is not especially inventive on my part. But Bach had, as the most important thing in his life, not his compositions. The most important thing in Bach's life was his Christian faith. Bach loved the Lord. Bach also had 20 kids, so, I mean, he was productive, right? And Bach was asked, he was not famous in his time. He was famous 100 years after his death. Bach was asked in his lifetime, "Herr Bach, why do you write music?" Crazy, right? "Jim, why do you write books? Any of you, why do you do what you do?" Now, you're going to give a flippant answer ordinarily. It pays the rent, right? I'm good at it. I like it, right? And that's not what Bach said. Bach said, "I write music for the glory of God and the good of man." Can each of us say that? Can each of us say that about our careers? That's why I'm here. That's why I came to AEI. Because I want to glorify God, and I want to benefit my fellow man, and I want to do it with my work, and I want to do it by promoting a set of ideas. I want to work on better public policy, but I want to promote a just and good and merciful and compassionate free enterprise system, because you know what? It's the only way we can get it done. When I was a kid, when I was 6 years old, I remember the face of poverty. My brother got the National Geographic magazine. And I remember, in those days, like the early 70s, poverty was a picture of a kid in the National Geographic magazine with flies on his face and a distended belly. And there was nothing we could do about it. Nothing. It was a lost cause. Africa was lost. Poverty was over there. It was desperate. It was horrible. I mean, I could put some money in the basket on Sunday, but fundamentally it was drops in the ocean, right? Okay, I'll wake up 30 years later and 40 years later. What's changed in the world? Well, I'll tell you what's changed in the world. Notwithstanding what people think, 70% of Americans think that hunger is worse. It's not. 80% of starvation level poverty in the world has gone away since I was a kid. There's been a reduction of 80% in the number of people in the world, the percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less. Now, there's way too much. There's too much poverty in Bethesda, so there's way too much poverty in Mozambique, let me tell you. But an 80% reduction, what did that? It wasn't the United Nations. It wasn't the World Bank. It wasn't the International Monetary Fund. Good institutions or bad institutions, we can debate that. That's a debate, as Jim says, for another day. But it wasn't those things. I'll tell you, as an economist, I will tell you what did that. It was globalization. It was free trade. It was property rights. It was the rule of law, and it was entrepreneurship. It was the American free enterprise system, properly understood and executed in the right way, that pulled 2 billion people out of death and poverty that would destroy their lives. 850 million people out of the People's Republic of China alone, not because it's such a great country with so much liberty, but because it became a country that engaged in free trade. Now, I know that these systems aren't perfect. I'm not the kind of guy who says capitalism is the answer for everything. Remember, I tell conservatives 8 days a week that it's time to declare peace on the safety net, and it's time to expand the EITC to make work pay. Everything Jim said is right. But remember that Matthew 25:14 brings life to its fullest because people can earn their success, and that is social justice every bit as much. Remember, Jim told us, it's really important, that a safety net is good and just. We have the moral privilege and obligation to be able to provide it, but it doesn't relieve poverty. People have to be lifted up and to lift themselves up. And only by understanding that you can have a system that allows people to develop their talents in both the biblical and the modern sense can that get done. I want to quote Bono, the front man of U2. He's got a new album out today. It's free on iTunes, for your information. That's a real profit-making strategy. Bono is a tireless advocate for the world's poor. And he's not just a rocker, he knows a lot. You know, because you've seen the things that he said, he's been heroic in the things that he's done to wipe out poverty around the world. Here's what he said at Georgetown University last year, and I quote, "Aid is just a stopgap." And he's in favor of aid, and so am I. Aid is just a stopgap. Commerce and entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid. In dealing with poverty here and around the world, welfare and foreign aid are a band-aid. Free enterprise is a cure. Entrepreneurship is the most sure way of development. Unquote. The bottom line is this: true social justice requires each one of us have a preference for those who are vulnerable. Because, indeed, they are us. A system that stimulates all of us to behave in a way that lifts other people up in massive numbers is a good system. In my view, the meaning of AEI, the why of this institution, is the willingness and ability of each one of us to promote that system and work for it in a way that helps the poor the most. Thank you, and God bless you.
Well, I think that may have been the new U2 album being downloaded real time,
Yeah,
which is great.
That's right.
Don't waste time. And thank you so much, Arthur and Jim, for a really inspiring start. I got questions here about learned helplessness and earned success, and about prophet, priest, and king from reading books, and there's not time to get to it all. I want to ask one question to start things off before we turn to audience questions, which is about the comment that Jim raised at the beginning about the idea of stopping trains, things that are sort of in motion. I've heard Arthur talk before about this idea of the Gini coefficient. You know what that is? That's the idea that 0 is absolute equality and 1 is absolute inequality. And where are we on that sliding scale right now? Well, in the last 5.5 years, we've actually moved from 0.47 to 0.48. We are more unequal today than we were 5 years ago. And I wonder if you might each comment on one practical thing, this is 1 minute or less, that could be done in private or public sector to redirect that trajectory and or to help lift the poor.
Go ahead, Jim, please.
I mentioned the bad combination of increasing inequality, which is true all over the world now. In South Africa, it's still true, and diminishing social mobility in this country, which is a problem that lacks. So I heard a line in South Africa that I loved. It said, government should help in a massive redistribution of opportunity. And I love that phrase. We're worried about redistribution of opportunity. Massive opportunity is finally the best way to overcome inequality. And that just doesn't exist in South Africa. I always like to walk the streets of Soweto and talk to kids in the street. And I heard this time, what has Mandela done for me? My life hadn't changed. How are things different? And some of the children of the heroic leaders who invited me in there when I was a young man in the 80s, their kids now are wanting a second revolution. And that's a problem. I went to Zimbabwe. Also, while I was there, I saw the land taken from white farmers by Mugabe's government. No one seemed even farming it now. That alternative didn't work. I saw in Zimbabwe, although I saw pastors doing foundational farming, meaning organic farming, tremendous yields, changing their neighborhoods, their regions, and they would agree with this notion of being entrepreneurs. So I think opportunity is the key thing here. And I do want to go back to when there is such a gap between, Mike Gerson talks about this too, when we're losing wage capital and we're only affirming investment capital, we have a problem. Those who make wages, most of us, their wages have to work better than what they do now. So that's a question, I think, for business leaders. How can we talk about living wages? So there's an internal issue in business and there are external policy issues. But I love, and I'll say this, I love you were kind of talking about vocation. This is a vocational question for Christians. Running bureaucracies or making money are not the vocations we're called to. What do we do in our vocations that really lifts up the poor? That's a vocational question for all of us. And that, I think, is the best way to overcome inequality.
As a practical matter, I mean, look, what did Jim just say? The problem that we have is opportunity inequality. And we can measure it in income inequality, but the real problem we have is opportunity inequality. Virtually everybody thinks that, except for, people who are sort of fringy at this point. Most Americans don't think that income inequality per se is a good thing, because if that's a problem, you can do it in Cuba, which isn't so great. And I don't think anybody wants that. You just sort of bring the top down as much as you can, per se, without lifting the bottom up. So let's settle that that's really what the discussion is all about. The income inequality that stimulated the book that Josh talked about a minute ago, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, that was a very French book that said that, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, I could mean that pejoratively, but I'm not. I mean, it was a very French book insofar it was talking about the differences in money per se and how those differences were going to grow. And it sort of falls dissonantly on the ordinary American ear because opportunity is what we really care about. This is what we want to do to lift people up. What is responsible for the widening income gap? Because there is one. What's responsible for that? Two things. Jim correctly pointed out that, that investment income is skyrocketing in this country, and that wage income, particularly in the two bottom quintiles, are falling in this country. Why? Investment income is increasing because we are printing tens of billions of dollars a month in free money, which is being poured into financial markets, and it's torching equity markets. And 81% of those gains since January of 2009 have gone to the top 10% of the income distribution. That's the reason. That's the reason. It's bad public policy that's doing that. Well, what about the reason that work is bringing less prosperity to people in the bottom two quintiles? That's a little bit harder because it's got some economically structural explanations. It has to do with the fact that the American economy is changing, that the skills that people require are changing. But there are also reasons that have to do with the fact that in the so-called recovery from this recession, we don't have policies that are stimulating companies, institutions to hire. I mean, that's the truth. The weirdest thing about this non-recovery, it's non-recovery if you're the bottom half, because families in the bottom half on average have seen falling median income every year for 7 years. Imagine this. They keep hearing on TV that the recession is over. We've got modest growth, right? They're going, my brother-in-law's still sleeping on my couch, right? And I think I might lose my job, and I have less money than last year, and it's been going on since 2007. So what's the deal? And what the deal is that we're not warriors for job creation in this country. We don't have public policies that try to look at the regulations that are standing in the way of policies that we can understand, policies that we can predict. We don't have tax policies that persuade companies to onshore their companies into the United States. We have public policies that basically are hostile to job creation, especially for those who are poor. Now, add to that, I think the really appropriate ideas that Jim had about making work pay. Now, we would have a discussion about minimum wage. Why? Not because I'm worried about the cost of business, but because I'm worried about the asymmetric impact, particularly on African American young men who tend to lose their jobs when you increase minimum wages. It's a great policy for giving a raise to my teenage children. It's not such a great policy for the people who you most care about in the workforce. What we want is a policy that really makes work pay. We want to expand it to single men, and that's the expansion of the EITC. It's really expensive, the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's really expensive, but we know how to do it. We need to police the fraud and spend the money. And if we do that, we can actually do really great things to make work pay for these people. Then let's talk about policies. It doesn't matter if you're on the right or you're on the left. Let's talk about ways that we can encourage corporations, big and small, high skill, low skill, low wage retail and service, all the way through to manufacturing, to the trades, to expand their workforces. And actually, we know how to do that too. The problem is we're just not doing it.
One of the things that this conversation could help do is set an agenda for further conversations, which would be very helpful. For example, on the regulation question, one of the problems we have there is kind of a one-size-fits-all. George McGovern, who was in favor of many regulations, when he began to own a bed and breakfast, began to say, but some of these regulations are really tough for our bed and breakfast here. So I think we haven't had enough regulation at the top in terms of banks and all the rest, which I think helped lead to the crisis in 2008. We've had too much regulation in terms of small business, the broader economy. What's the difference between what kind of regulation or control or accountability top banks need and bed and breakfasts need? That's an important question to talk about. And regulation is not in or changing regulations to be more business friendly or job creation friendly is not in conflict with the need for more consumer protection of low-income, middle-income families that are being abused by the policies of credit card companies and all the rest. A megachurch pastor, good friend of mine, Joel Hunter, I'll name his name, did a survey in his congregation of the debt in his mostly white, affluent congregation. Not house debt, not car debt, but credit card debt. Average $31,000 debt. He called that debt slavery. Their behavior of certain banks, credit card companies, is creating debt slavery among middle-class people. So we got to look at those questions and sort of sort those out. So we're not liberals and conservatives against all of this, what works and what doesn't work, to protect people and make opportunity even greater. Student loans. I'm about to have a kid go to college, right? Student costs for that are something middle-class people have to deal with.
So we got a couple questions in the audience, and maybe just to combine two. One about family structure says that in Southeast Washington, D.C. today, just across the Anacostia River, we have 91% of African-American 17-year-olds living not with their father and mother, just right across, just 4 miles from here. So this question is, what are some practical things that the church can do to help us better smell like the poor, and shepherds to smell like the sheep?
Okay.
Yeah, you bet.
Right, yeah.
Parishioners to smell like the
It doesn't sound good to say you're going to smell like the poor. I mean, that's just, this poor don't smell so bad. I mean, the sheep smell bad, right? So anyway, all right.
That's true.
Yeah.
Fair enough. But Steve Sutherland talked about this last night, some trips that are happening with Bob Woodson. He said he's been out with Arthur and with others to spend time with communities. So what about that? And what is the impact, the important impact of family structure vis-a-vis poverty today? Last question to round us out.
Well, I'll make one comment because I really want to hear what Jim has to say. So I'm going to say it and clear out. You got to talk about it. Right in the front row here is Robert Doar. He was the Commissioner for Welfare Services for Mike Bloomberg for the past 7 years. Right now, when he took over, when they started, there's 1.3 million New Yorkers getting cash payments. When he left, there was less poverty and less need, and 350,000 New Yorkers getting cash payments. Like magic, right? Nuh-uh. That was during a recession. What did he do? He didn't do that by not talking about things that are true, right? He didn't do that by not talking about the manifest truth that Jim revealed. Jim is not a right-winger. I mean, newsflash, right? And he said, families matter, right? It's important. You have to grow up in a family. And the data agree. Read our stuff by Brad Wilcox. Read the stuff that Robert. So what did Robert do? I mean, it's like, I love this. I mean, he had so many enemies. It was awesome. In New York City, it's easy. I mean, we all have enemies in New York City. So, and Robert put a bunch of advertisements in the subway, like pictures of babies. Are you ready? Do you know how much this costs? That's what he was saying, right? It was advertising to single moms, people who were, the point was, he was taking them seriously. He said, you have moral agency. You're smart enough to make good decisions. You're not an idiot. Think about this. The picture of a baby, right? He gave them moral worth enough to take them seriously, and he said what was manifestly true. Imagine if we all did that. Imagine if government did that. Imagine if conservatives and liberals got together to say the truth and loved poor people enough to talk to them like adults. It's a good place to start.
If we care about poor people, anyone who cares about poor people has to be committed to reweaving the web of family and community. We're losing marriage across our society, in all our classes, but it's mostly worst impacting poor people. We have to commit to that politically across the board, which means looking at welfare programs which undermine family. That doesn't work. It also means taking seriously what pastors will tell you. Getting a good job that pays a living wage helps rebuild families. It really does. So jobs are important to rebuilding families. And I'm glad to see people from both sides of the aisle beginning to take on mass incarceration. The fact is that data is very clear. Arrest, conviction, and sentencing for people doing the same crime in the same place of different races is profoundly different in our society. That is racialized criminal justice. And if we don't take that on, we're going to see poor communities emptied of fathers and husbands. The answer to family in the poor community isn't just dating services in the ghetto. It's dealing with a commitment to rebuilding family life and those external factors which are undermining it, both in the public and private sector. That commitment could bring us together across political lines, like a commitment to making work work and education, reforming education, so kids are the focus of schooling. These things are not left and right. And if we take them seriously, they're going to challenge both sides. And we have to be willing to do that and lead, I think, as people of faith.
Please join me in thanking Jim Wallis and Arthur Brooks.